Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's topic. We're going to be looking up at the satellites orbiting our planet and exploring exactly how we use machine learning to make sense of the massive, and I mean massive amounts of data they capture. We're going to break down the fascinating process of image classification, specifically focusing on how we actually teach machines to understand the Earth's surface.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Picture this. You're a remote sensing analyst working on a major consulting project in Southeast Asia. You're handed a single satellite mosaic and given a pretty daunting task. Map an enormous 50,000 square kilometers. You need to identify forests, rice paddies, urban zones, the whole shebang. But here's the catch. You have absolutely no field data, zero ground truth, and a very strict 2-week deadline. Sounds basically impossible, right? But this is a very real scenario, and it establishes exactly why today's topic is so incredibly important.
So, what does this all mean? How do you actually solve a practical puzzle like that? How do we categorize every single pixel of that huge digital landscape accurately and, more importantly, quickly? Well, remote sensing analysts rely on two primary machine learning tools. And as you'll see, each of these tools approaches the problem from a completely different philosophy. They both have distinct strengths and definitely their own flaws before they ultimately team up to create the perfect mapping solution.
All right, Section 1, the Satellite Mapping Challenge.
Satellites capture our world in these massive grids of literally millions of pixels, and each one of those tiny pixels contains really complex reflectance values across multiple spectral bands. Basically, to make a map, we have to make sense of all that digital noise. And that brings us to our core concept, image classification. Simply put, this is the process of categorizing every pixel in a raw satellite image and assigning it a specific land cover label, like forest, urban, or water. The whole thing works based on one fundamental principle. Different feature types on the Earth's surface reflect light differently, so pixels with similar spectral characteristics and reflectance values are highly likely to represent the exact same type of land cover.
Moving on to Section 2, Supervised Classification, Guided Machine Learning.
Think of this method kind of like a teacher giving a student a highly specific set of flashcards to study right before a final exam. That's supervised classification in a nutshell. It's a guided learning process. The absolutely crucial requirement here is that the user must have prior knowledge of the study area. The human analyst literally tells the algorithm exactly what to look for by manually identifying and defining representative training samples, which are often called regions of interest. You're basically pointing to a spot on the image and saying, "Hey computer, this right here, this is a forest. Learn what its spectral values look like."
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact workflow we use. You start with your raw input image, right? Then you move into supervised training, where you feed the algorithm those manually created sample regions. From there, the algorithm learns the statistical rules linking those specific spectral values to your labels. Finally, applies those rules to classify every other unknown pixel in the entire image, finishing up with a rigorous accuracy assessment. Now, behind the scenes, there are some absolute heavy-hitting algorithms doing all the complex math for us. You've got the incredibly popular Maximum Likelihood Classifier, or MLC, which estimates normal distribution probabilities to assign pixels to the class they most likely belong to. Then you have machine learning powerhouses like Random Forest, which propagates multiple decision trees and support vector machines, or SVMs, which use statistical theory to find the optimal decision boundaries between classes. It's really powerful stuff. Because it is so heavily guided by human expertise, supervised classification generally yields a really high overall accuracy. To put that into perspective, let's look at a study area in Hazy City, China, where researchers compared a few different algorithms. They found that the supervised maximum likelihood method was highly effective. It hit an impressive 82.3% classification accuracy rate with very few leakage points. That is a solid grade for the algorithm.
But here's the catch, and this is absolutely crucial. The output of a supervised classification is literally only ever as good as the training data you provide. It's the classic garbage in, garbage out scenario. If you only sample lowland forests, the algorithm is going to completely fail to recognize mountain forests because it just lacks that spectral variability. Or, if you accidentally include a grassy park in your urban training sample, you confuse the algorithm with mixed pixels. And if you have wildly unbalanced samples, well, your final map is going to suffer from some major misclassifications.
This brings us to a really stark contrast. If supervised classification requires prior knowledge, a huge investment of time, and perfectly guided training samples, what on earth do we do when we have zero ground truth and a tight 2-week deadline? We have to completely switch gears. We go from the teacher guiding a student model to basically handing a student a massive box of puzzle pieces and simply saying, group the similar colors together.
Which leads us nicely into Section 3, Unsupervised Classification, Automated Data Clustering.
With this approach, we shift our focus entirely away from human guidance, and instead we rely on pure machine autonomy to do the heavy lifting. Unsupervised classification is an automated clustering process that operates completely without any prior knowledge. None. Instead of manually drawing examples of forests and water, the user simply specifies the desired number of clusters they want, say 15 or 20. Then the algorithm examines all the pixels and iteratively groups them based strictly on their spectral similarity and statistical features. Let's see how this builds a totally different workflow. With this method, we go straight from the raw input image directly into clustering. The machine separates unknown pixels into distinct groups with absolutely zero direction from the analyst. Because of this, it is incredibly fast and absolutely ideal for exploring unfamiliar landscapes where you just don't have the ground truth data you'd need for the supervised method.
The two most common algorithms making this happen are k-means and isodata. K-means evenly distributes initial class means and uses a minimum distance technique to iteratively assign pixels. Isodata, on the other hand, is even more adaptive. It actively splits heterogeneous clusters and merges similar ones. These algorithms are fantastic at revealing the natural spectral structure of a landscape. They can even identify obscure soil mineralogies that wouldn't even be obvious to the naked human eye.
Moving right along to Section 4, the labeling problem. Now, what's really interesting here is that all this machine speed and autonomy, well, it definitely comes at a cost. The main drawback is what we call the labeling problem. Because unsupervised classification pushes the human expert to the very end of the process, once the algorithm actually finishes clustering everything, a human analyst still has to step in, manually evaluate the data, and assign a meaningful land cover label to each and every group.
And here is exactly where things can go a bit sideways. Machine clusters don't always perfectly align with real-world human categories. For example, a machine might look at a single forest and split it into 3 completely different clusters: sunlit canopy, shaded canopy, and edge pixels. Or conversely, it might look at a dark lake and a mountain shadow and just merge them into a single identical cluster, because spectrally speaking, they look exactly the same. Because of this labeling issue, unsupervised approaches generally produce lower classification accuracy than supervised methods.
All right, finally, let's look at Section 5, the hybrid approach.
So we're stuck with a bit of a dilemma, right? Supervised is highly accurate, but it requires prior knowledge and data we might not have. Unsupervised is super fast for the unknown, but it suffers from that pesky labeling problem. The ultimate solution isn't about picking sides, it's about combining them. In practice, a hybrid approach yields the absolute best results. You start by running an unsupervised classification with a large number of clusters. This acts as an exploratory map to reveal the natural spectral structure of the land. You use this to understand the landscape and pinpoint those tricky, ambiguous areas. Then, you use that fresh knowledge to strategically collect highly accurate training samples. Finally, you feed those perfect samples into a supervised classification algorithm, like random forest. This hybrid method perfectly solves our consultant's 50,000 square kilometer dilemma from the beginning. You use the machine to explore and map the unknown, and then you use the human expert to guide the final accuracy.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to take away. As our machine learning models, neural networks, and automated clustering algorithms continue to evolve and get smarter every day, will there come a time when we no longer need to manually guide the machine at all? Will the spectral data eventually be able to speak entirely for itself, perfectly mapping our world without any human intervention whatsoever? It's a fascinating question to ponder. I hope this explainer has given you a solid foundation to keep exploring the constantly evolving world of remote sensing. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.